She lay in the dirt while someone else decided what she was worth. Why didn't she flinch when the boot came down inches from her face? The Mojave heat didn't just burn, it accused. It pressed down on her back like a hand reminding her to stay small. Morgan Rivers lay prone on the ridge, camera tucked into her chest, lens pointed toward men who didn't see her. 20 Marines. One jagged cliff. A mile of air between steel targets and pride. Hold your breath, squeeze, don't jerk it. The voice cracked with rage. Gunnery Sergeant Razor Vance sounded like a man arguing with the world. His shooter missed again. Dust kicked up low. Wrong wind. Wrong call. Everyone felt it except Vance. Morgan didn't look up. She counted seconds. She watched heat waves fold the valley into illusions. She measured wind with her eyelashes, not a meter. Again, Vance barked. Another miss. That was when he noticed her. "You," he said, already angry before he finished the word. She lifted her head slowly, shielding her eyes from the sun. Her face was calm, too calm. "You're breathing too loud, shifting your weight, you're throwing off my shooter." "I'm just documenting." "I don't care." The boot came fast, gravel sprayed. Red dust filled her mouth, her eyes, her lens. Dirt scraped glass. The camera took the hit meant for her dignity. "Get your toy and get back to the truck," he sneered. "This is a kill zone, not a poetry class." Someone laughed. Someone else looked away. Morgan wiped her face. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't explain. They thought that meant she agreed. They didn't know she had already calculated the wind vector of his kick. They didn't know her heart rate had dropped, not risen. Thump, thump, controlled, reptilian. They didn't know she had learned stillness in places where movement meant death. She gathered her gear and crawled back, every motion deliberate, invisible again. That was safer. From a distance she looked like support staff, Navy utilities, hair tied back, camera tech assigned to training documentation, polite, quiet, forgettable. That was the version on paper. The other version lived in a sealed folder deep inside a building with no windows. A name crossed out, another written in red, a call sign that never appeared on rosters. Viper. Morgan Rivers had left the teams 2 years earlier after a mission that ended without answers. Not failure, something worse, survival without closure. She had chosen anonymity like a tourniquet, tight enough to stop the bleeding, painful enough to remind her why. Behind her the exercise escalated, brass arrived, expectations tightened. She sat near the general's vehicle, camera resting on her knee, lens reflecting the valley like an eye that never blinked. When Vance made the wrong wind call, she whispered it without thinking. 8 at the muzzle, 22 at the apex. No one heard her. The shot missed by 6 feet. Vance needed a reason. He pointed at her. "She's interfering." "A lie," said loudly enough to sound official. The general turned to Morgan. "Is that true?" "No, sir." Her voice was steady. That made it worse. "She's shaking," Vance said. She was, not from fear. From restraint. The radio cut through the tension like a blade. Real world, armed tangos in the valley. Everything changed. She stood before anyone told her to. When Vance froze, she didn't ask permission. She removed him from the rifle like a faulty component. Her voice dropped, command-level calm, the kind that doesn't explain. The shot she took wasn't heroic, it was necessary. She fired between heartbeats. And the valley answered. The first explosion erased doubt. The next shots erased time. Movement stopped where she decided it should. When silence returned, it wasn't awe that filled the air. It was shame. Later, when the counter-sniper revealed himself, she did what she had always done. She listened. Tracked sound, tracked vapor, tracked intention. When she fired blind, it wasn't luck. It was faith built on years of surviving consequences. When the enemy fell, She exhaled for the first time in minutes. After the helicopter rotors faded, the general looked at her stance. "I know that posture," he said. She nodded once. She packed her broken camera carefully. Tools mattered, symbols didn't. Vance approached her like a man stepping onto thin ice. "I was wrong." She didn't need to hear it, but she let him finish. "Respect," she said, taking the cracked lens cap, "is the only weapon you don't reload." As she walked away, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ridge. She didn't look back. Some lessons don't need witnesses. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. She felt it before anyone said it out loud. Why did the air suddenly feel heavier, like the mountain itself was holding its breath? Morgan stayed seated near the general's vehicle, knees drawn slightly inward, camera resting against her thigh like a shield no one believed in. Around her, the platoon reset with forced confidence. Voices were louder than necessary. Laughter came too fast, the kind that tried to erase embarrassment by pretending it never happened. Gunnery Sergeant Vance paced behind his shooters, barking corrections that sounded more like accusations. Every missed shot felt personal to him now, not because of the brass watching, because of her. She could feel his anger tracking her movements the way a scope tracked heat. He hadn't forgiven the silence. He hadn't forgiven the way she didn't shrink enough. Morgan adjusted the strap of her camera and forced her breathing to stay slow. She had learned long ago that fear made noise inside the body. It rattled bones. She couldn't afford that. Not anymore. This was supposed to be easy. Hide in plain sight. Document. Stay useful without being dangerous. But the problem with being invisible was that people stopped seeing you as human. They filled in the blanks with whatever made them feel larger. She remembered the briefing room on her first day attached to the unit. The way conversations dipped when she walked in. The way eyes slid past her to more important things. She had brought coffee because it gave her hands something to do, something non-threatening. She hadn't minded then. She told herself she wanted it that way. Now, sitting in the dirt with grit still stuck to her cheek, she wasn't so sure. The general conferred quietly with his aide. A cigar glowed between his fingers. Authority condensed into small movements. When he turned back toward the range, everyone straightened instinctively. "New objective," he said. "Moving target, 2,400 yards." A murmur rippled through the platoon. That distance wasn't impossible, but it was unforgiving. Every mistake multiplied, every ego exposed. Morgan's fingers tightened around the camera body. Her mind was already running numbers, angles, probabilities she didn't want. She told herself to stop. This wasn't her lane. Vance dropped behind the .50 like a man stepping into a ring. His confidence was louder than his breathing. He trusted metal more than intuition, trusted charts more than air. "Wind," his spotter called. "Full value left," Vance snapped. 15. Morgan winced almost imperceptibly. The canyon wasn't honest. It never was. Walls twisted airflow into patterns that punished assumptions. She could see it in the sagebrush a mile out, bending in opposing directions. She could feel it lick her cheek, inconsistent, deceptive. She whispered without realizing it, just air moving past lips. "It's not 15. No one heard her. Or if they did, they dismissed it as habit. Camera girls talk to themselves sometimes. Nervous energy. Vance fired. The wait stretched, 3 seconds, long enough for doubt to bloom. The round missed, wide right. The silence afterward was brutal. The general's disappointment wasn't loud. That was worse. Vance stood, jaw tight, eyes scanning for something to blame. They landed on Morgan like they'd been waiting there. "It's her," he said quickly, her gears interfering. Morgan looked up slowly. She didn't understand how something so obviously false could sound so confident, but she had seen it before. Rank had gravity, lies bent around it. The general turned to her, studied her face, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Is that true?" "No, sir," she said. Her voice didn't shake. That almost cost her. "She's lying," Vance pressed. "She's been a distraction all day." Morgan felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears, anger, the kind that came from being misread so completely it felt like erasure. She thought of the file with her name on it, the missions that would never be acknowledged, the nights spent breathing through panic she wasn't allowed to have. She wanted to say something sharp, something precise enough to cut. Instead, she stayed still. That was when the radio screamed. "Alert, real world." The word carried weight, training evaporated, muscles tightened, hands found weapons without instruction. Morgan's spine went cold. This wasn't supposed to happen here. She was already scanning when the call came through. Armed tangos, cartel, mortar tube. Her eyes snapped to the valley, movement where there shouldn't be any, shapes emerging from shadow. The general shouted orders. Vance dove for the rifle. And froze. Morgan saw it immediately, the tremor, the hesitation, the way panic disrupted rhythm. She knew that look. She had worn it once, long ago, before she learned how to survive it. "They're setting the tube," someone yelled. Seconds collapsed. Vance couldn't find the target. Mirage, wind, everything conspiring against him. The Marines opened fire, but it was futile. Rounds died short. Distance laughed at them. Morgan stood. She didn't decide to. Her body moved before permission existed. Camera slipped from her hands and cracked against stone. The sound felt final, like shedding skin. She crossed the space between herself and Vance in calm, measured steps. He looked up at her like she was an intrusion. "Get up," she said. "What? Now?" Her voice carried something that made him obey before his pride could protest. She hauled him back with strength that surprised them both. When she slid behind the rifle, the world narrowed. Noise fell away, the shouting, the fear, the judgment. There was only wind, distance, intent. She didn't look at the meter, she never had. She adjusted by feel, by memory, by instinct sharpened through consequence. When she fired, it wasn't rage. It was relief. The explosion in the valley was ugly, necessary. She didn't watch it. She was already tracking the next movement. Shots followed, controlled, efficient. She spoke in a flat voice, calling targets like coordinates on a map she'd memorized years ago. When silence returned, it wasn't triumphant. It was stunned. She stood slowly. Her legs trembled now, delayed adrenaline catching up. She grounded herself with breath. 1, 2. She turned to Vance. "Your scope was zeroed high," she said, "and you were jerking the trigger." No insult, just fact. Before anyone could respond, instinct screamed. She tackled the general as the bullet cracked overhead. Stone exploded where his head had been. Her heart slammed, fast now, loud. "There's a sniper," she said, "high ridge." The counter-sniper was good, patient, waiting for chaos to reveal itself. Morgan felt the old fear creep in, the one she thought she'd buried. This shot would matter. She took Vance's helmet, used it as bait, counted the seconds between sound and impact. When she fired blind, it wasn't confidence. It was trust, in herself, in the woman she had tried to forget. The bullet's flight felt endless. When the enemy fell, something inside her loosened. Afterward, when the helicopter arrived, when silence settled into understanding, she felt exhaustion hit her bones. She packed her broken camera carefully, like it still mattered. The general approached. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "I know that stance." She nodded. She wasn't proud, not yet. As she walked toward extraction, dust swirling around her boots, she felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the fatigue. Not vindication. Hope. Quiet, unassuming. Earned. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was hiding from herself anymore. She noticed the silence before she felt the pain. Why did everything go so quiet after the helicopter disappeared? The rotors had barely faded when the adrenaline drained out of Morgan all at once, leaving her limbs heavy, her thoughts slow. The desert returned to itself. Wind whispered through sage. Heat settled back onto skin like a blanket that didn't care what had almost happened. Around her, Marines stood frozen in positions they hadn't been trained for, staring at a woman they were certain they understood an hour ago. No one spoke. No one laughed now. Morgan kept her head down as she reattached the camera strap, fingers working carefully around the cracked lens housing. The camera was damaged, but not destroyed. That felt symbolic in a way she didn't have the energy to unpack. She could still feel the rifle's recoil in her shoulder. Her heartbeat hadn't fully slowed yet. Thump, thump, faster than she liked. She focused on breathing through her nose, counting the space between pulses like she used to. It helped, a little. The general cleared his throat. That sound snapped everyone back into formation. Years of conditioning took over. Boots shifted, spines straightened, weapons lowered but not fully relaxed. Morgan remained where she was. She didn't feel like she belonged in the shape they were forming. General Mitchell stepped closer, studying her with the kind of attention that made most sailors uneasy. Not judgment, recognition, the dangerous kind, the kind that could unravel carefully constructed anonymity. "You moved before anyone ordered you to," he said evenly. "Yes, sir." "You disregarded rank." "Yes, sir." "You saved my life." She didn't answer that one. Because it wasn't the truth she was afraid of. It was what came after. Vance stood off to the side, helmet under his arm, eyes fixed on the ground. The man looked smaller now, like something had collapsed inward. Morgan had seen that before too. Ego breaking was louder than gunfire if you listened for it. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" the general asked. Morgan hesitated. Images surfaced uninvited. Mountains that didn't forgive mistakes. Radio calls that never came. A friend's blood darkening snow. A decision that split her life into before and after. "I learned to listen," she said finally. The general nodded slowly. He understood enough not to press. Or maybe he understood exactly how much pressing would cost. He dismissed the platoon to debrief and secure the area. Orders rippled outward. Purpose returned. People were grateful for something to do that didn't involve thinking. Morgan stayed behind, kneeling near the cliff's edge, camera raised again. Old habits died hard. She framed the valley through cracked glass, documenting the smoke still curling upward from where the mortar team had been. Her hands were steady now. Vance approached carefully, like someone entering a room where they'd once broken something valuable. He stopped a few feet away, unsure. "Chief," he said, the word tasting unfamiliar in his mouth. She didn't correct him. "I owe you an apology," he continued, "for today, for before." Morgan kept her eye on the viewfinder, let him fill the space. "I thought I knew what competence looked like," he said. "I was wrong." She lowered the camera at last and met his gaze. He looked tired, older, like the desert had finally gotten its due. "I wasn't offended by your words," she said quietly. He blinked. "I was disappointed by your certainty." That one landed. Vance swallowed. "I won't make that mistake again." "No," she agreed, "you probably won't." They stood there a moment longer, the wind moving between them, carrying dust and something like humility. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ridge, Morgan found herself alone near the general's vehicle again. She sat on the tailgate, boots dangling, watching light change the color of the rocks. She felt hollow, not empty, hollow, like something had been removed, leaving space that didn't know what it was for yet. The general joined her without ceremony. He offered her a bottle of water. She took it. "You disappeared," he said. She smiled faintly. "I tried." "Why?" That question was heavier than it sounded. "Because staying visible gets people killed," she said after a moment, "and because I didn't trust myself to stay." He waited. "I lost someone," she added. "A mission went wrong, not tactically, personally." He didn't ask for names. "I stepped back before I started making decisions for the wrong reasons," she said, "before anger replaced judgment." The general nodded. "And now?" She looked out at the valley, at the place where violence had briefly rewritten the landscape. "Now I remember why I stepped forward in the first place." A pause. "You know this won't stay quiet," he said. "I know." He studied her profile. "You could come back, there are ways." Morgan shook her head slowly. "Not yet." She needed time to decide if the part of her that pulled the trigger still belonged in the world she'd been trying to live in. That night, sleep didn't come easily. She lay in her temporary quarters staring at the ceiling, listening to the bass settle. Engines in the distance, boots on gravel, somewhere laughter. Her mind replayed the day in fragments, the kick of dirt, the sound of the helmet being struck, the way the enemy sniper had waited, patient and precise. She felt the old guilt stir, the quiet question that always followed survival. Why me? She sat up and reached for the camera, turning it over in her hands. The crack in the lens distorted her reflection, splitting it into pieces. Photographer, operator, ghost. She wasn't sure which one she wanted to be anymore. Outside, the desert cooled. Stars emerged, indifferent and constant. Morgan lay back down and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring reports, questions, consequences. But for now, she let herself feel something she hadn't allowed in years. Pride. Not loud, not celebratory. Just enough to remind her that she was still capable of choosing who she was becoming. And that choice, she knew, would be the hardest mission yet. She woke before the alarm, heart already racing. Why did it feel like the mission hadn't ended, only shifted shape? The desert dawn crept in through the thin curtains, pale and unforgiving. Morgan lay still, listening to the bass breathe. Generators hummed. A distant truck shifted gears. Somewhere metal clanged against metal. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Her body didn't believe it. She sat up slowly, rolling her shoulders, testing for soreness. It was there. A dull ache where the rifle had settled. Bruises forming beneath skin. Proof. She welcomed it. Pain grounded her in the present. Pain meant she was here. On the small desk beside her bed, the camera rested exactly where she'd placed it. Lens cracked, body scratched, still functional. She ran her thumb along the fracture without thinking, tracing it like a scar. The knock came sooner than she expected. 3 sharp raps, official, unavoidable. She opened the door to find a junior officer standing stiffly in the corridor. "Senior Chief Rivers," he said, correcting himself halfway through the title like he wasn't sure which version applied. "General Mitchell requests your presence. Briefing room, 0800. She nodded. "I'll be there." As the door closed, she exhaled slowly. This was the part she'd been postponing, the after-action, the scrutiny, the translation of something instinctive into something bureaucratic. She dressed carefully, navy utilities, nothing that stood out, hair pulled back, face clean, no visible edge. On the walk to the briefing room, Marines passed her with new eyes. Conversations paused. Salutes were a fraction sharper. Respect, yes, but also uncertainty. They didn't know where to place her anymore. Neither did she. The briefing room was already full when she entered. Maps lit the walls, footage queued on monitors. The general stood at the head of the table, hands braced, expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit. They played the footage first, drone angles, helmet cams, audio slowed then isolated. Her voice carried through the room, calm, precise, stripped of emotion. Hearing it felt strange, like listening to someone else speak her thoughts aloud. "Walk us through your decision-making," the general said. Morgan took a breath. "I assessed wind shear from terrain interaction. The mortar team's urgency suggested poor concealment. The counter-sniper waited for us to commit. I used auditory triangulation to identify his position. No embellishment, no apology." In the final shot, someone asked. She hesitated just enough. "That was risk," she said. "Calculated but still risk." Silence followed, not disapproval, respect. The general leaned back. "You exceeded engagement authority." "Yes, sir." "You ignored rank." "Yes, sir." "You neutralized a threat no one else could." She didn't respond. He studied her a long moment. "I'm recommending commendation." Her stomach tightened. "No," she said quietly. A few heads turned. "Sir, with respect," she continued, choosing each word carefully, "commendations create questions. Questions create exposure. Exposure brings expectations I'm not prepared to meet." The general's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, in understanding. "You don't get to choose the consequences of your actions," he said. "No, sir," she replied, "but I do get to choose whether I pretend I'm ready for them." The room stayed quiet. Finally, he nodded. "We'll keep it minimal," he said, "unofficial for now." For now hung in the air like a promise and a threat. After the briefing, Morgan stepped outside into the sunlight. The heat was gentler in the morning, but it still pressed against her skin. She welcomed it. Vance waited near the steps. "I asked to be reassigned," he said without preamble. She stopped. "Why?" she asked. He looked uncomfortable. "Because I need to relearn how to lead without confusing volume for authority." She studied him. The man was stripped down now. No bluster, just honesty. "That takes time," she said. "I know," he replied. "I hope when I'm done I won't need to prove it." She nodded once. "Then you're on the right path." They parted without ceremony. Later that afternoon, Morgan found herself back on the range. Empty now. Targets still stood in the distance, scarred and silent. She lay prone out of habit, elbows sinking into warm dirt. She didn't pick up a rifle. She picked up the camera. Through the cracked lens, the world looked slightly off, distorted, imperfect, real. She framed the ridge where everything had shifted, where she had crossed a line she thought she'd erased. She wondered if hiding had ever truly protected her, or if it had only delayed the inevitable confrontation with herself. As the sun climbed, her radio crackled softly. "Rivers," the general's voice said, "one more thing." She lifted the mic. "Go ahead, sir." "You ever think about teaching?" The question caught her off guard. Not operational training, not marksmanship. Teaching meant patience, presence, accountability. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Think about it," he replied. "People don't just need heroes. They need translators. Someone who can explain the difference between confidence and competence." The line went dead. Morgan lowered the radio and stared out at the empty valley. She thought about the younger version of herself, the one who believed excellence would protect her from being misunderstood, the one who learned the hard way that silence could be weaponized by others. She pressed the shutter. The click echoed softly. That night she wrote an email she didn't send, to a unit that no longer officially existed. She thanked them for what they'd given her, and for what they'd taken. She deleted it before bed. Some conversations were meant to stay internal. As she lay down, exhaustion finally claimed her. Not the sharp crash of adrenaline, but the slow surrender of a body that had been holding itself together for too long. Before sleep took her, one thought surfaced, gentle and insistent. Strength didn't always mean stepping forward. Sometimes it meant choosing where to stand when the dust settled. and she was still learning how to do that. She didn't dream that night. Why did that unsettle her more than the memories ever had? Morgan woke just before dawn again, not from fear this time, but from absence. No flashes of desert stone, no echo of gunfire, just a blank, quiet space where her mind usually fought itself. The calm felt borrowed, temporary. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, and let the stillness exist without questioning it. That, too, was something she had to relearn. The base moved slower this morning. Word had spread, but no one knew how to speak about it yet. Stories hadn't formed. Legends hadn't hardened. People were cautious with their curiosity. That suited her. She dressed and stepped outside, the air cool against her face. Somewhere nearby, recruits were running cadence, voices uneven, breath untrained. She listened for a moment. There was a time when she'd been one of them, counting steps, trusting the process, believing every answer lived in someone else's authority. She walked until the noise faded and found herself near the flight line. Aircraft slept in long shadows, metal skins catching early light. She paused, drawn by the quiet power of them, machines built for distance, for leaving. She wondered when leaving had become her instinct instead of arriving. Couldn't sleep either. The voice belonged to the general. He stood a few paces away, coffee in hand, no entourage. Just a man who had survived long enough to recognize survivors. "I slept," she said, "just differently." He nodded, accepting that as complete. They watched the horizon together. The sun rose slowly, patient in a way humans never were. "You ever regret stepping back?" he asked. The question wasn't a trap. It didn't feel like an evaluation, just curiosity shaped by experience. "Yes," she said, then after a moment, "and no." He smiled faintly. That's usually the right answer. She wrapped her arms loosely around herself. "I needed to remember who I was without the weapon. Turns out, I forgot how to remember." The general took a sip of coffee. "Identity's a stubborn thing, it waits." Later that day, she was asked to observe a training block. Not instruct, just watch. A safe distance. She agreed, telling herself it was temporary. Everything had been temporary lately. The Marines moved through drills with renewed seriousness. Less swagger, more listening. Vance wasn't there. Someone else led, quieter, more deliberate. Morgan noticed how that changed the rhythm, how fewer voices didn't mean less authority. One of the younger Marines kept glancing her way, nervous, curious. After the drill, he approached, helmet tucked under his arm. "Ma'am," he said, unsure of the title, "I wanted to ask yesterday when you took the shot." She waited. "How did you know you were ready?" The question hit harder than she expected. She considered deflecting, giving him something technical, safe. Instead, she told the truth. "I didn't," she said. "I just knew I was responsible." He frowned slightly. "Readiness is about skill," she continued. "Responsibility is about consequence. When you accept the second, the first usually shows up." He nodded slowly, absorbing that in his own way. "Thank you," he said and left. That evening, Morgan sat alone in her quarters again, camera spread out on the desk. She disassembled it carefully, cleaning dust from the interior. Precision work, familiar, comforting. As she worked, she replayed the general's question from the briefing. "Teaching." She imagined standing in front of a room again, explaining patience, explaining restraint, explaining that the shot you don't take can define you as much as the one you do. The idea scared her more than combat ever had. Combat was honest. Teaching required vulnerability. Her phone buzzed, an old contact, a number she hadn't seen in years. She stared at it for a long time before answering. "Morgan," the voice said, familiar, roughened by time. "I heard you were back." "I was never gone," she replied quietly. A pause. "We could use someone like you, not for what you do, for how you think." She closed her eyes. The offer hovered, heavy with implication. "I'm not ready," she said. "I know," the voice replied. "That's why I called." The line went dead. She set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling again. The absence of dreams returned, but this time it didn't bother her as much. Readiness wasn't a switch. It was a process. That night she wrote again. Not an email, not a report, just a page in a notebook she'd carried for years without using. She wrote about wind, about silence, about the weight of being underestimated and the danger of believing it. She wrote about dignity, how it didn't announce itself, how it survived even when buried. When she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it beside the camera. Two tools, different purposes, same truth. As she turned out the light, she realized something had shifted, not in the world but in her. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing still long enough to decide where to go next. And for the first time in a long time, that choice didn't feel like a loss. She felt the decision before she named it. Why did clarity arrive so quietly, without permission or ceremony? The morning came soft, almost gentle, as if the desert had decided to offer mercy. Morgan sat on the edge of her bunk, boots unlaced, hands resting on her knees. For once her heart wasn't racing ahead of her thoughts. It stayed with her, present, willing. That was new. The notebook lay open beside her. One page filled, just one. It wasn't much, but it was honest. She reread the last line she'd written the night before and then closed it carefully, as if sealing something fragile. Outside, the base was waking up. Orders would come. They always did. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was waiting to be told who she was. She walked toward the operations building without urgency, letting her pace match her breathing. Marines passed her, some nodding now, others unsure what protocol applied. She didn't correct them. Respect that was demanded felt hollow. Respect that arrived on its own, that lasted. Inside, the general was already there. He looked up when she entered, as if he'd expected her. "You're early," he said. "So were you," she replied. He smiled. "I had a feeling." They sat across from each other, no table between them this time. No maps, no screens, just two people who understood what the other had survived. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I assume you've thought about my question." "Yes, sir." "And—" She inhaled slowly. "I won't be going back to the teams." He nodded, unsurprised. "I didn't think you would." "But I won't be disappearing either," she continued. "Not this time." That got his attention. "I'll teach," she said, conditionally. He leaned back. "Go on." "I won't train people to pull triggers faster," she said evenly. "I'll train them to wait, to listen, to understand what happens after the shot. If that's not what you're looking for, I walk away." The general didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, watching a pair of helicopters lift off in perfect synchronization. "That's exactly what we're missing," he said finally. She felt something settle inside her, not relief, alignment. Word spread slowly, the way meaningful things often did. No announcement, no ceremony, just a change in routine. Morgan Rivers began showing up to training blocks not as an observer but as a quiet presence at the edge of the formation. She didn't raise her voice, didn't correct immediately, she watched first. When she spoke, Marines leaned in without realizing they were doing it. She talked about wind the way others talked about terrain, about patience as a skill, not a personality trait, about how ego distorted perception long before it ruined outcomes. She never mentioned Syria, never mentioned her call sign. She didn't need to. One afternoon, a Marine missed a long-range shot and cursed under his breath. The frustration was familiar, sharp, personal. Morgan knelt beside him. "What did you feel just before you fired?" she asked. He blinked. "Pressure." "From where?" He thought, "From myself." She nodded. "That's the most dangerous direction it can come from." The lesson stuck. Weeks passed, the desert shifted toward winter, mornings grew cold, breath turned visible. Morgan found she liked that, proof that effort existed, that bodies were working. She fixed her camera one evening, replacing the cracked lens with a new one she'd ordered quietly. The old glass she kept. She placed it in the notebook, tucked between pages, a reminder that clarity often came after distortion. Vance stopped by once, newly assigned, posture changed. He didn't ask for forgiveness again. He didn't need to, he asked questions instead, real ones. That told her everything she needed to know. On her last night at the base before rotating to a training facility up north, Morgan stood alone on the ridge where it had all begun. The valley lay quiet beneath her, indifferent to memory. Stars cut clean lines across the sky. She didn't lie down, she didn't take a shot. She just stood there, feeling the wind move past her face, cataloging it out of habit. 8 at the muzzle, 22 at the apex. She smiled faintly. For years, she had believed redemption required distance, that healing meant leaving the place where you broke. She understood now how incomplete that was. Sometimes redemption didn't mean going back. Sometimes it meant staying, long enough to make the space safer for the next person who felt small in it. She turned away from the cliff and walked back toward the lights, toward voices, toward a future that didn't ask her to disappear to be effective. Morgan Rivers wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't a legend either. She was something harder to define and far more necessary. A presence. And in the end, that was the lesson she carried forward, not just for others but for herself. Strength didn't always announce itself with noise or violence. Sometimes dignity didn't speak at all. It simply acted.